Howdy my totally tubular gamers, it is that time again for a ranking video, and today's ranking video is going to be on the Crash Bandicoot series, one of my most beloved, cherished, favorite game series of all time, arguably my favorite platformer series of all time, and well, we're going to be ranking them. Yeah, that's right, we're going to be ranking every Crash Bandicoot game. I'm talking all the platformers, I'm talking all the kart racers, I'm talking all the side games. We're ranking all of the Crash Bandicoot games. I want a very complete list here. The only ground rule I will set is that I am only going to be adding one version of each game on here. So like the original Crash trilogy, if I put that on here, I'm not going to put the Insane trilogy. If I have Crash Team Racing on here, the original, I'm not going to include the remake of it. If I have Crash Nitro Kart, I'm not going to have the Game Boy Advance version of it on here. I'm going to keep it to one version of each game on here, but we're going to do every single Crash Bandicoot game. And so with that little ground rule out of the way, let's just get right into it with what I think is easily the worst Crash Bandicoot game ever made. At the bottom of the list is Crash Boom Bang for the Nintendo DS. Now this game is not good. This game is not even close to good. This game is a Mario Party ripoff, but I honestly feel bad for even saying that. Like, Mario Party should not be associated with this. This is just a minigame collection on the DS that, well, it's not fun. Not a single minigame is even close to enjoyable. They're all just very mundane, boring, unresponsive, and not even fun in the slightest. And the game does little else, honestly, and it just doesn't hold a candle to any kind of party game that's been released in the last 20 years. With a pitiful roster, terrible unlockables, very poor graphics, even worse sound, and just, again, minigames that I'd rather just be playing nothing than playing this, because this sucks. And that's the worst Crash Bandicoot game. And we have, for the second worst Crash Bandicoot game, we have Crash Bandicoot Purple, Ripto's Rampage, which was that weird Crash Spyro crossover on the Game Boy Advance. However, just like the previous game, sadly this game is a minigame collection as well, and it's on the Game Boy Advance, meaning that, well, the minigames aren't going to be the most in-depth, and while I obviously would set my expectations a bit lower, this game still fails to exceed them, as these minigames are, they're just bad. Like, they're really just bad. They're not fun, they control terribly, they're not interesting, and I really have not all that much to say about them because I only played the game for, at the most, an hour or two and just gave up because it was not fun at all. And sure, there are a little bit of these platforming sections that are kind of in there, and if there was more of this in the game, it'd probably be a pretty okay at best game, but there's barely any of the platforming. It's mostly just the minigames, and I'd rather not be playing the minigames. And that's why this game, yeah, it's just not very good. And for the next game, we have the Crash of the Titan game. Now, this is the PS2, Wii, and 360 version. I have no comment on the DS and PSP version. Now, Crash of the Titans is looked at usually with quite disgust, and honestly, I kind of agree with them, as this game really is the low point in the main series of Crash Bandicoot, and was one of the reasons we didn't see Crash for so long, because this game is not very good. With some really bad redesigns of Crash and Friends, with some really uninspired gameplay that is quite different from the other Crash Bandicoot games, where most of the game is like a beat-em-up brawler that is just far too basic for its own good and is not very fun at all, with very uninspired levels that are just basically straight with the, and not in the Crash Bandicoot fun straight, like literally, like there's just very little platforming or level design at all. You just kind of go from one area to area just beating up enemies, and then throw in the Titans where you get on them and fight other Titans and enemies, and it's just not very fun. And sure, some of the Titan designs weren't that bad, but it again just was not very engaging. It's quite mundane. This game really just kind of just showed that Crash Bandicoot had changed, and not for the better, and Crash of the Titans is, again, definitely the low point in the main series. The next game on our list is Crash Bash. Now, I know I might be upsetting some by having this game so low on the list, but I think Crash Bash is just not a good game at all. As a kid, it definitely pissed me off, and it frustrated me, and with good reason, because I don't think it's a good game. It controls just terribly. The controls on all these minigames are not good. It is a very shameless minigame collection that tries to be like Mario Party, but is nowhere near comparable to the N64 Mario parties, and is arguably the worst party game on the PS1. Like, even the Shrek one was better. This game is just not good. Very frustrating to me. I remember the AI just cheats like crazy. It's not really fun in multiplayer either because the controls just suck. It's so unresponsive. The mini games, there's only a couple in the game. If there was like a bunch and maybe like some sucked and some was good, it'd be like, oh, okay. But no, there's really only a handful of mini games. They aren't very good. The story mode's not very good. And it just doesn't do anything above a very, very mediocre party game at best. It's not a good game. The next game on our list is a actually okay game, and that is The Huge Adventure. Now, Crash Bandicoot The Huge Adventure is a platformer on the Game Boy Advance, and with such, you got to give it a little bit of leeway because platformers on the Game Boy Advance were not the most advanced, I guess. Haha, you get it. But this game is actually pretty decent. It's a fun little platformer that throws in some of the best parts of the original couple Crash Bandicoot games, being a strictly 2D platformer with some very ugly graphics, I might say, but decent little music pieces here and there, and some fun levels. It's not the most complex platformer, and the controls are a bit finicky, but I still had fun with it, and it is what it is. It's not a very long game, and it doesn't do anything disgraceful or terrible to the Crash Bandicoot series, but it's not something I would rank very high on this list. And now we have the sequel to the previous game, and that is Entranced. So Crash Bandicoot Entranced really just kind of improves on the previous game with a little bit better level design. It's still got those ugly graphics that just look terrible blown up on a big screen. Decent sound, and the game is a decent challenge. It controls a bit better, I can definitely say that. And the level design is a little more interesting, and I like Entranced, I guess. I mean, he was a new character here, and he was fine enough. But again, the game just doesn't do all that much to make me really talk about it very much. It doesn't stand out all that much. It's a fine little 2D platform on the Game Boy Advance, but it just doesn't stand out all that much. And if you love the game, cool, but for me it just kind of sits there as a okay game. The next game on the list is Crash Mind Over Mutant. Now, before you get the pitchforks out, don't hear me out. The game isn't the best. The game isn't very good, and I think it's okay at its very best, but Crash Mind Over Mutant is definitely quite a bit better than Crash of the Titans. And while I do truly I really hate this concept of Crash with the Titans and all that. I hate the concept. I will say the game is decent. The game it is a decent game with decent platforming, much better level design than Crash of the Titans, and the game actually has a few interesting elements. Sure, I hate the character models. I'm really confused by how many different animation styles there are with the cutscenes, and the voice acting could be a hell of a lot better, including with the story. But there are some interesting gameplay elements here. Some of the mutants are definitely interesting. They're a lot more interesting than anything Crash of the Titans had. The level design is not just a straight line and it's just boring with a lame-ass beat-em-up sections. There's actually a fair amount of platforming here, and it's not terrible. And there's even a little bit of backtracking and Metroidvania elements here where you need certain mutants to get to certain parts of levels. It's not terrible. It's not exactly great, and it's not good in some aspects, but it is a decent enough game that I can say that it's very mediocre and can leave it at that. But I still wouldn't recommend it to anybody or anything, but I mean, it's not the worst Crash Bandicoot game, and it's certainly better than Crash of the Titans. And here we have the first Crash racing game on this list, and that is Crash Tag Team Racing. I think Crash Tag Team Racing is definitely the low point of all the Crash Bandicoot racing games. And while it's not a terrible game, it is a best decent game, but I definitely think it is a quite mediocre racing game as a whole. Now, it's so weird. There's two parts to this game. There's like this racing part, which is what you'd expect, and then there's like this open area 3D platformer part of the game that is just really odd. Now, this game has just a wild sense of humor with a weird story. There's farting and burping noises everywhere, all over the loading screens, all over the place. There's all these crash death scenes. It's really odd. The platforming is not very good. The open areas are just kind of shallow. There's not much to them. You can explore a little bit, I guess, but as a kid I had fun with this, but nowadays this really doesn't do anything for me. And so, I mean, I guess that was at best like okay, but the racing is quite mediocre, I'm not gonna lie. Like, all the tracks are very basic. There's not much to them. There wasn't a single memorable track, in my opinion. It was quite boring. There's just not much to it. The racing is just not very exciting. It doesn't do anything that the previous racing games for Crash Bandicoot did. The entire concept is just kind of confusing. Like, there's no reason to not team up with one of the other racers, stick with them until the very end, and then bail at the last second. Like, that's every single race. It's like really just kind of broken and boring. Like, it just doesn't do anything. Like, it's such a boring racing game, and I can't believe I'm saying that, but that's just the honest truth of it. This game really didn't do much for me, and that's why it sits at just about the middle of this list. Like, it just really didn't do much for me. And the next game on our list is Crash Bandicoot Wrath of Cortex. Now, Wrath of Cortex, as a kid, I thought it was pretty good. But nowadays, yeah, Wrath of Cortex really isn't that great of a game. At its very best, it's a decent little 3D platformer, but really just pales in comparison to any of the previous Crash Bandicoot platformers. Like, it's not that great of a game. The biggest issue with Crash Bandicoot Wrath of Cortex is easily that the game has way too much variety for its own good. Instead of focusing on some core 3D platforming like the previous games with the occasional gimmick level, this game is like all gimmick levels with very little 3D platforming, and the 3D platforming levels are actually quite fun. They're actually decent. There's just not very much of them in the game. There's all these stupid other gimmicks like the minecart, the kart racing, the ball where you play as Coco, the scooter. Like, there's just way too many gimmick levels, way too many vehicle levels. The game is just not, it's not very good because of that. Most of these gimmick levels aren't very fun. They're really not all that engaging. They all control very poorly. Like, that's just a common theme around the whole game. It all controls very poorly, and I think it could have been a hell of a lot better. The graphics are very odd, even for the time. The music's pretty good, I'm gonna give it that. The story with Cortex and Crunch, I mean, it is what it is. I'm not really gonna harp too much on that one, but the biggest thing was definitely the levels. And while I have 100%ed this game more than once, I just don't think it honestly holds up very well, especially compared to the other Crash Bandicoot games, and it's just kind of a mess. It's just kind of a cluster, and I couldn't really recommend it to anybody, especially in today's day and age. And the next game we have is Crash Nitro Kart, and we're looking at the PS2 version, not the Game Boy Advance version. That is an interesting version, though. But Crash Nitro Kart is actually a pretty fun little racing game. Sure, it basically is just a carbon copy of Crash Team Racing and not as good, but I still had a lot of fun with it, and it plays still very well, honestly, even today. The character roster is interesting. The courses are actually pretty decent, especially out of time. That's a great level. But I actually did have a lot of fun with this game as a kid, and still can come back to it and have some fun. And almost all of the courses are in the new remake for Crash Team Racing as well, so there's that too as well. But the game by itself, I think it's actually pretty fun. It has a fun little story with this like kind of versus Coliseum kind of stuff, and I think that a lot of the tracks are actually pretty engaging. They're interesting. The drifting is still really well done, and I had a lot of fun with this one, and it actually puts up a good challenge. Like, this game does put up a good challenge. It might just be the rubber banding, but I had a lot of fun with it. I have some fond memories with this one, and I can still honestly recommend it, which is definitely a good thing, as the racing does hold up, and it actually is able to hold my interest still, which is definitely a good thing. And here we have the original Crash Bandicoot. Now, before you get the pitchforks out, before you start getting all pissed off at me, hear me out for a second. The original Crash Bandicoot, it's a classic. It was important to PlayStation. It was important to 3D platformers as a whole. It was one of the first true 3D platformers. And again, bona fide classic, and nobody can take that status from it. But coming back to it all these years later, especially with the Insane Trilogy, Crash Bandicoot 1 really is just alright. I think it's just alright. The game is overly difficult. It's very punishing. Completing it 100% is just a nightmare, honestly. And it's just not very fun in that aspect. But a lot of the levels are, again, very punishing. A lot of them are not that fun. I didn't really have the best time with most of the game. I found a lot of it frustrating. The controls could be a lot better. They just weren't very good here. I think Crash's weight is just so messed up, I think, in the original Crash Bandicoot, and it just kind of kills a lot of the game for me. And sure, I like some of it. I love the music, I love the bosses, I love the ending, of course, and a lot of it is still fun, and it is still a good little 3D platformer that is a classic, and I think most people should try just to see where Crash Bandicoot came from. But as a whole, I don't think the game stands up all that well, especially when we're comparing it to every other Crash Bandicoot game, like in this ranking kind of video. I don't think it holds up all that well compared to the other ones. Still a good game, though, don't worry. The next game on our list is Crash TWINSANITY. Now, Crash TWINSANITY I have a huge amount of love for and nostalgia for. It was arguably the first real game I ever played, like ever, and so I really just love this game. I really adore it, and I get that it's not the best, and it has a number of issues. It's quite unfinished, it's buggy, it's glitchy, the controls are not very good for the most part, but I just love this game, and I'm able to look past a lot of it. I can't look past all of it, but I look past a lot of it. The music is by far the best music in the entire Crash Bandicoot series. Like the acapella music, it just doesn't get any better than this in my opinion. It's some of my favorite music in any video game. I love the music in Crash TWINSANITY. I could go on forever about the music. It is so good. Like, it genuinely is so good. The story is actually pretty good too, I think. I think the story is actually quite enjoyable. Reminds me of a Saturday morning cartoon, but like a good one. And CORTEX steals the show. CORTEX is just fantastic in this game. I love CORTEX. Him and Crash have a great chemistry, and I think that the gameplay is still fun. It's still decent. It's a good little 3D platformer, but similar to Wrath of Cortex, kind of, there is a little bit too much variety. The game just tries to do a little too much, and a lot of the time when it tries to do something other than the main platforming, it's not all that great. And I'm not gonna lie, a lot of these gimmicks aren't that great. The controls are not the best throughout the game. Like, it's a very slippery kind of feeling game. The slide jump isn't the best. Some of the level design isn't the best. Some of the bosses aren't the best. But I will say, you know what, actually most of the bosses are pretty damn good in this game, especially the beginning kind of bosses. I really quite like those. And the game is just hilarious throughout, being one of the funniest games I ever played, for sure. But I, again, understand that it is quite buggy. Collecting all the gems is kind of pointless. It's very slippery, and that the game is really unfinished, especially as a whole. Either way though, I still quite like Crash TWINSANITY and still rank it pretty high among these Crash games. And at the number 4 spot we have Crash Bandicoot 2. Now, some people would say Crash Bandicoot 2 is even the best one, and you know what, it is pretty damn good. Crash Bandicoot 2 is a certified classic and a massive improvement on the original game. The biggest thing is that they added that slide jump. The slide jump is a literal game changer to Crash Bandicoot as a whole, and it's never been the same since, and it's for the better. The slide jump is just so much fun. The story is pretty decent, taking place right after the first game, and I quite like how everything progresses. And the biggest thing with this game is the levels. The levels are such a huge improvement on the first game, with so many more themes than just the boring jungle theme of the first game. You'd be really hard pressed to find a bad level in this game, except maybe Cold Hard Crash and that shitty jetpack level. But other than that, I think the gameplay is quite good, the levels are really engaging, and it's a very good 3D platformer that honestly gets as much love as it deserves, because it definitely deserves all that love. And the music is quite good, and while some of the collectibles can be a bit cryptic, I will say, that's definitely sure. The game totally makes up with it, with just its personality, its humor, and again, just solid controls. What a great game. And at number 3 we have Crash Team Racing. Now for this one, you could put the original in there or you could put the remake. It doesn't really matter. I have them about the same anyway. I love Crash Team Racing. Now Crash Team Racing is arguably my favorite kart racer of all time. Like, Crash Team Racing I think is just such a fun racing game with arguably the best drifting mechanics in any racing game. I love the drifting mechanics. It's so rewarding. It's so engaging. It's so much fun, and you feel so fast. You feel so fast in Crash Bandicoot Team Racing. The game goes for a Diddy Kong Racing style approach to a single player, with a whole story mode, with a hub area where you go to races. They threw in a bunch of fun little Crash Bandicoot things from the series, like the time relics, collecting the gems and the boxes and the crystals. Like, I just really enjoy Crash Team Racing on so many levels. Like, it's such a fun racing game. I just don't think it gets much better than this. It's so skill-based. Like, that is one thing that I will always love about Crash Team Racing, is how high the skill ceiling is. You feel so fast. There's all this tech you can do that is not present in like any other racing game that's in the kart racing genre. Like, the tech is so high in this game, and it is just such a blast, with a great character roster as well. And even the remake, despite the shitty microtransactions, really kept it intact, and it's still a very fun racing game today, with very good tracks that are very memorable, with some interesting boss fights, And I just think Crash Team Racing, like when it comes to kart racing, especially on the PS1, it doesn't get any better than this. It just doesn't get any better than this. It's so much fun. And if you like kart racers and haven't played Crash Team Racing, what are you doing? What are you doing? Like, for real. It's just that good. And at the number 2 spot, we have Crash Bandicoot 4. And honestly, I'm just as surprised as everyone else. Crash Bandicoot 4 is just a fantastic game overall. Like, I played it last year and was just almost blown away with how good Crash 4 is. Like, Crash 4 is just something else, and it's really surprising and really exciting to see how good Crash Bandicoot 4 really is, and how well it stacks up against the other Crash Bandicoots, especially considering it was not created by Naughty Dog. Like, when I first saw the masks that they introduced, all these like physics kind of masks, I really was like, oh boy, here we go with some gimmicks. But no, they're all really well done. And the story was also pretty well done. Taking place after Crash 3 and wiping out Wrath of Cortex, it sees Entropy and Cortex coming back to try to defeat Crash. And I do like the story quite a bit in this game. I think it takes some interesting turns and is pretty good, especially considering what it is. And then you look at just how this game looks. This game looks freaking incredible. The graphics are just stunning. This game looks like a Pixar movie. Like, legit, it looks amazing. Graphics aside, though, the gameplay is actually superb. The controls are just the best controls maybe for any Crash Bandicoot game ever. Like, they're so well done. The levels are so well done. These levels are just handcrafted, are just really well done. They really play to the strengths of Crash Bandicoot. There's no stupid gimmick levels like at all in this game, except the rollerball for a couple levels, and it controls well. Like, the levels are just so much fun. You get to play as all these other characters, and aside from Cortex, they're all really fun to use. They're all really different, and I've really had a great time using all of them. This game really, honestly, could very easily be my number 1. It really could. But the only reason it's not is because the collectibles, 100%ing this game is a freaking nightmare. And I think that if you're just playing through the game, collecting what you can, playing through all the levels at least once, this game is arguably the best Crash Bandicoot game of them all. It's just so good and it's so refreshing. But when you want 100% it, this game is worse than a nightmare. This is like a hellspawn. This is like going to go down as one of the hardest platinums for any game on ever. Like, to get every achievement for, like, it's gonna go down as one of the hardest games. And like, this game is not easy. This game is hard. It is definitely hard. It's not gonna hold your hand. And you know what, honestly, I just really love Crash Bandicoot 4. Like, it was arguably like the best non-Mario 3D platformer in probably like a decade at this point. Like, it was just so good, and I can really only be excited for what happens next with Crash Bandicoot after this game. Like, what a great game. Truly, what a great game. Like, if you haven't played it already, again, what are you doing? What are you doing? And hey, a bonus note, while in the middle of making this video, they announced it's coming to PC and Switch and PS5 and Xbox, whatever the new Xbox is called. So, hey, you should totally pick it up. There's no reason not to. It's amazing. And at number 1, it's pretty obvious if you've been paying attention or even a decent Crash Bandicoot fan, it's gotta be Crash Bandicoot 3. Warped! I love Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped. I think it's one of the finest, greatest 3D platformers of all time. Like, in my opinion, most games don't really stand up to Crash Bandicoot 3. I think it just does everything right. With a fun little story and superb controls, this game really is just a joy every time I've 100%ed it. 100%ing the game is not a freaking hellspawn nightmare disaster like the 4th game, and I think that 100%ing Crash Bandicoot 3 is the way to go, because the game is just so much fun, and collecting everything is just such a great time. The levels are just immaculate. They're just the peak Crash Bandicoot. They're all great. There's not a single bad level in the game. And you know what? There's a bunch of gimmick levels in here. There's like where you're on the jet ski, there's like when you're in the sky, and there's when you're on the motorcycle. And you know what? They actually are really well done. They all control well, except the motorcycle's a little weird, but they all control really well. They all add to the experience, unlike Wrath of Cortex where it detracts from it, and they're just superbly done. Like, the levels are just not only all very different from each other, they all play different, but they all have their own like shtick going for it, and it's like, that's the best thing about a 3D platformer, is when it keeps you engaged, interested, and it's showing you new stuff until the very end of the game. It doesn't repeat like anything, and it's so much fun. The power-ups, in my opinion, are the best power-ups in all of Crash Bandicoot. They control the best as well. The double jump, the super spin, the rocket launcher, the running. It's all great stuff. The new additions that they have, like the time relics, which now are in all the Insane Trilogy, it's really good stuff here. And I think that it just does very little wrong. And it's like the perfect length as well. Not going on forever and ever, and it's not too short either. And it's like I don't even have all that much left to say about Crash Bandicoot 3 because it's just that good of a game. Oh, it has great music as well, with a killer main theme that has become kind of iconic with Crash Bandicoot. And when I think of Crash Bandicoot, not only do I think of PlayStation, I think of this game. I think of Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped because it really just is the pinnacle, the apex of Crash Bandicoot. In my opinion, to a little extent, every Crash game after this has just kind of tried to recapture what Crash Bandicoot 3 did. Even Crash Bandicoot 4 does that a little bit. And sure, Crash 4, it's arguably better than Crash 3, but I just think Crash 3, I just don't think anything will ever beat Crash Bandicoot 3. And in the future, I'm sure there'll be more Crash Bandicoot games now, and I really just don't ever see them beating Crash Bandicoot 3, sorry. I love Crash 3, and that's how I'm going to end this video. If you haven't told me what your favorite games are by now, please do so in the comments. Like, if you made it this far in the video, please tell me what your favorite games are. I'd love to hear. I love talking to other Crash fans. We can all agree at least that the original trilogy is great, Crash 4 is great, and Titan sucks. We can all agree that. Either way, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. You could subscribe, of course, that would do me wonders. You could comment, you could like, you could share, you could really help me out there. That's bars. I got Patreon if you want. Either way, you have a great Christmas, New Year's, Valentine's Day, Memorial Day, President's Day, holiday, 4th of July, whatever the thing is. See you guys later.